What is up YouTube? I'm Royal, I'm rank 1 Wildrift, and welcome to my patch 6.0D tier list. This has been a very good patch, as you've heard pretty much every content creator say, because a lot of really good nerfs happened, primarily to Echo, Ambessa, and so on. There's definitely a few buffs that were very unnecessary, as Riot usually does, like Wukong, Graves, Corki. Corki wasn't. I will talk about Corki when we get to mid and ADC. But for now, let's focus on the Baron lane. In the God tier, we have a couple new champions. So I've decided to remove Fiora and Jax from my God tier list. And while they're still really solid champions, I think there's definitely a distinct tier between the God tier and the S tier champions. I think that Renekton, Rumble, and Gnar are, and even last patch was probably a mistake from me to not have Gnar in the God tier. He's actually just incredibly versatile, so I've decided to include him in the God tier now. And Wukong is actually going to be joining them from the S tier. Wukong received some massive buffs that were definitely unnecessary, that help him the most in the Baron lane. So his passive now will give him more health regeneration. His first ability is on a lower cooldown and has less mana consumption, so he can keep spamming it in the laning phase, constantly healing and becoming stronger. So in general, his mana cost has gone down, his third ability as well, which was one of his main issues, making him not super good in the Baron lane. But with this issue removed, he can actually be a huge threat in the Baron lane. His laning phase extremely strong, and of course his team fights are absolutely insane with his ultimate. So Wukong is actually in the God tier in the Baron lane. Mordekaiser has also moved into the S tier. He received some very nice buffs, especially while his ulti cooldown was increased, which again is only 5 seconds, but it's his main spell, right? His first ability received a very nice overall buff in the laning phase. And as long as Mordekaiser is good in the laning phase, he's going to be good throughout the game because he's a stat check champion. He just needs to get a lead, then ult you and beat you up in his ulti. So he's going to be in the S tier. The Aurelia buffs, while they're nice, right, they're okay, they will make her early game even worse to make her late game better. And obviously the early game will only be slightly worse, but in the Baron lane, when you have all these terrible matchups against you, right, like half of these champions just completely counter you, like Renekton, Wukong, Malphite, Jax, Fiora, all of these champions completely counter you, right, and your good matchups are like even. So she will remain C tier in the Baron lane, but she has been buffed up slightly in the mid lane. Another thing to note is Ambessa get nerfed, and she's gonna fall even further down in the Baron lane, where she's already not too good. Her laning phase is simply too weak. Now let's move on to the jungle, and we see Wukong in the God tier in the jungle as well. Again, the buffs he received were just unnecessary. He was already really strong, already had him in S tier, and I think now he's definitely gonna be a God tier champion. Another addition in the God tier is Graves. Graves received some extremely unnecessary buffs and is now so tanky just from the base magic resistance he gets, but also from his third ability, passive. He's able to get so much more armor in the early game, which is going to make him a menace in early game fights, and his first ability will increase his clear speed. One of the main things that I always talk about with junglers is how fast is their clear speed. If their clear speed is fast, they're going to now always be good champions, and increasing Graves' clear speed makes him just that, a great champion. So he'll join Amumu and Zed in the God tier, and of course Lee Sin will also remain there. Echo will drop to the S tier. He received some massive nerfs, mostly focused in the jungle. His clear speed will be quite a bit weaker this patch, and like I said, clear speed is so important in junglers. The main thing he had going for him was that his clear speed was just insanely fast, so he was able to just turbo scale in the late game. That won't happen anymore. I still think he's an S tier jungler, but again, now you have better options. So if you want to play an AP jungler, Lilia will be just as good. If you want to play like a late game jungler, Graves is going to be a better choice. If you want to focus on assassins, Zed is going to be a better choice. So I still think he's a good champion, but nowhere near as strong as he was last patch, where he was just the best champion in the game. I think this was a good balance change that will keep him viable in mid lane, while definitely diminishing his jungle power. And Bessa has also dropped in the A tier. Her clear will be quite a bit slower this patch. She's still okay, she's still playable, right? But she's just not going to be able to keep up with the junglers like Graves, like Zed, like Lee Sin, like the Wukong now. Of course, Hamumu is going to stay in the God tier. She's just absolutely insane because his clear speed is so fast and his teamfight value is absolutely crazy. Moving on to the mid lane, and here we can talk a bit about Corki. So Riot completely baited us, as you saw from my posts. So Corki was initially released with wrong stats, so the patch notes had different stats on what he was released with. And I immediately said when I saw the stats, oh my god, Corki's so broken, right? But Riot just released him with completely different stats than what the patch notes had, so he felt quite a bit weaker in game, but this patch, they're reverting these changes. So they're adding more attack damage per level, and another thing that's actually missing from the patch notes again is the base attack damage. They did a hidden nerf and now they're doing a hidden buff that's not in the patch notes. So it might have been a complete mistake from Riot. Obviously it's super disappointing to not get the proper information, but not only did his attack damage per level go up, he got base attack damage buff too. So Corki, despite what the patch notes said, has gotten a massive buff, which will allow him to be in the God tier as the best choice for an AD mid laner. Obviously, Yasuo and Zed are great choices still in the S tier, and I also have Victor in the God tier. This is a champion I took out of the God tier and put into S tier after he received some nerfs, but now that I've played him a little more, I'm realizing that Victor is still absolutely insane when it comes to mage picks, and his late game damage is out of this world, so I've put him back into God tier where I think he belongs. Echo will maintain his S tier spot. The nerfs definitely focused more on the jungle, so I think he's just as good in the mid lane as he was last patch, maybe slightly weaker. Of course, Orianna and Castin will remain God tier, being completely untouched, and I still consider Castin to probably be the best champion in the mid lane, especially if you can get him in a good matchup, right? He's more of a situational champion, however, he's still really, really good. Annie has gone up into A tier, who I actually think is a surprisingly good pick this patch after receiving some decent buffs. Obviously, she's nowhere near as strong as she used to be before the massive nerfs she received, but I think Annie's actually a really, really good choice now. Her mana consumption, her first ability went down, so you can spam it to get your passive up. Of course, 15 extra damage and 5% ability power is also decent, and the movement speed on her shield will allow her to make more early game plays and make her a better roamer. Overall, I think these buffs are actually extremely good for Annie, so she's actually a viable champion. Now, all the champions in A tier are pretty viable, right? They're not as good as S tier and God tier, but they're great picks to play. Another thing I want to highlight, Lucian received some buffs. Obviously, these are not great for mid lane, right? Since his early game didn't really improve, but having even a slight reduction on his third ability cooldown gives him more options in the mid lane. So I think he's slightly better in the mid lane now, but he's still not a great pick. If you want an AD range mid laner, just pick Corki. Another champion I'd like to mention is Irelia, who is now in the A tier. I did think about putting her into S tier, because she's actually a great mid laner. Her laning phase is still really, really strong, even though it's slightly weaker now, but it was already way too strong that I needed to be. And her late game is actually quite a bit better now, so you can get huge leads in mid lane, facing easy matchups, right, like mages or like squishy other mid laners like Zed or Echo. These are all pretty easy matchups for Irelia. And then you can actually become a monster in the late game. You're not going to fall off as hard. So I did definitely debate putting Irelia into S tier. If I were to take one champion from the A tier champions and put them to S tier, it would be Irelia. Another thing I'd like to mention about Corki too is that Manamune received buffs, right? Manamune actually received nice stacking buffs. So Corki is even stronger with the Manamune build now. Speaking of Corki, while we move on to ADCs, he's actually joining Varus and Sivir in the God tier on ADCs as well. His damage is just so high right now. He's definitely one of the best champions in the meta. He provides quite a lot to your team, shredding the enemy's magic resistant physical armor with his third ability. So he's a great choice in the dual lane as well, because by lowering these resists, it helps his support to do a lot more damage too. So overall, he does synergize good with a lot of support as well. So he's just as good as Varys and Sivir. Another champion that I'd like to mention is Ezreal, has gone all the way up to S tier. Not only did he receive a buff on his first ability, giving him a lot more attack damage on his first ability, he gets a 10% AD scaling. He also benefits a lot from the Manamune changes, right? Since he's like, when you think Manamune, you think Ezreal, right? He's one of the champions that always builds Manamune. So both of those combined actually make him one of the best late game ADCs. Ezreal went from being one of the best early game ADCs a few patches ago, but with the changes that Riot has made, he's actually one of the best late game ADCs now. So he definitely needs to be in S tier. Of course, all the champions in A tier as well continue to be viable. The ADCs in B tier and C tier are quite weak. Samira and Lulu can be viable if you have like the right support for them, like Lulu Twitch or like Nodless Samira. However, there's just overall better choices when it comes to ADCs. Finally, moving on to supports, I've removed Ornn even though he's God tier because his play rate is just too low. I never see any Ornns. So I've removed him from the support tier, but he would be God tier in theory, right? The supports did not change, I think, at all. Maybe I made like a couple changes. I think Rakan I dropped into an A tier. The buffs just weren't as strong as I thought they initially were. But obviously Blitzcrank and Pyke will continue being God tier. Pyke is the only support that you can truly 1v9 with. Blitzcrank, it just has, his stats are just too high after the buffs they made a few patches ago, so he's gonna continue to be God tier. S tier champions, you have so much diversity in support role right now, and that's what I like. Mages are viable, enchanters are viable, tanks are viable, you can really play whatever. So there's not much to say about the supports, right? Not much changed. We did see a few rune changes that impact support quite a bit, like the Locket nerfs. However, Locket isn't that great to begin with, so not much has changed overall. So this will be it for my tier list. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and comment down below what champions you think I have underrated or I have overrated. Comment down below what champion you think is the best champion of this patch. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe for more Wild Rift content.